Us today for the second webinar in our ADHD webinar series, and it's Living with ADHD Strategies for Wellbeing. As you know, with the webinar series, we've been having some great topics and we're looking forward to the presentation today. My name is Elise de Monk. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm one of the accessibility advisors for Uni Access, which is our disability support service at UWA, and I welcome you today. Before we get going, what I'd like to do is to acknowledge that we're joining everyone from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people on the main campus at Crawley at UWA. The Whadjuk Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, their languages, beliefs and knowledge. And I want to pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today. So welcome. Before we begin, there's some housekeeping information that I wanted to mention to everyone who joins us today. Firstly, you can activate some captioning by clicking on the More Actions icon. It's kind of at the right with the three dots where it says More. And you can select then the turn on live captions option. So if that's something that you're wanting to do, please go ahead and do that in that function. Now this webinar is recorded and the recording will be available on Microsoft Teams post this event, and we're also going to put it up on the website in coming days. So today's webinar is going to be presented by Glenda Farmer, and Glenda is from the UWA School of Psychological Science. Glenda is a PhD candidate and she's under the supervision of Assistant Professor Geneva Ohan, Dr. Amy Finlay-Jones and Senior Lecturer Donna Bayliss. She holds a Bachelor of Science with Honours in Psychology from the University of Western Australia. The focus of her PhD is understanding the role of self-compassion in the mental health of university students with ADHD. So today, Glenda will be talking about the ways to reduce self-criticism and maintain a positive relationship with yourself as you pursue your academic goals. So thank you, Glenda, for your time, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for that intro. As you all heard, I'm a PhD student here at the School of Psych, and I'm researching the role that self-compassion plays in the mental health of uni students with ADHD. Which is what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So I'm just going to start by making you all feel better about yourselves with this academic transcript of my first semester at uni. This was a long time ago, and apart from being a shocking choice of subjects for me, in summary, I failed every single one or failed to withdraw and got kicked out. And how I have this record is that when I finally returned a couple of decades later, I've got my old student number back, and all of this was just waiting for me in Student Connect, like so rude. So someone suggested I should call this presentation What I Would Tell My 18-year-old Self, but nothing I could have told her would have helped because what she really needed was a diagnosis. And you guys have a diagnosis, so this is very good news. So first, I'll just tell you a bit about my research for context and introduce you to the concept of self-compassion. And if you don't like that term, that's actually not unusual. Just think of it as understanding and support, because that is essentially what it is, treating yourself the way that someone who cares about you and believes in you would. And then I'll tell you some things about what might be able to help with that. So in my research, I looked at the association between ADHD and how we treat ourselves when things go wrong. And in the student population as a whole, we find that as the symptoms of ADHD increase, self-compassion goes down, which I'm sure is no surprise to anyone here because it is an extremely frustrating condition to study with, and it's hard not to turn that frustration on yourself. Another thing I looked at is psychological distress, which is basically the symptoms of stress, anxiety and depression. And as ADHD symptoms increase, these do too, which is consistent with plenty of other research and also, you know, not surprising because living with ADHD, it can be quite stressful. Oops, no, one more thing to say about that. Yeah, so what's interesting is when we put these two findings together, we find that part of distress related to ADHD is explained by the way we treat ourselves. So being hard on yourself when things go wrong can make you feel considerably worse. So an interesting thing about ADHD that some of you already know, but others might not, is that emotion regulation can be a bit of an issue. Emotions can come on more quickly and be bigger and stronger, and so harder to control anyway, but then also the mental processes involved in regulating them can be a bit harder to operate. So when things go wrong, the negative emotions can be quite overwhelming. And that in itself is a pretty good reason not to pile on the self-criticism when things go wrong, because it just increases the emotional burden that you might already be struggling with. And what you really need is understanding and support. But we find that there is more of a tendency towards self-blame and self-criticism. So seeing difficulties as personal flaws and getting stuck on negative experiences and overwhelmed by emotions, maybe ruminating a bit or a lot. And moving to a more compassionate approach looks like being friendly and understanding and encouraging towards ourselves when things go wrong, and seeing our struggles and failures as part of being human. And keeping difficult experiences in perspective rather than zooming in on them. And the main question that we seek to answer when we use self-compassion is, what do I need? Now, just a word on self-criticism. It is the default mode for most people in our society, and there's a perception that when things go wrong, criticising yourself is the responsible thing to do, and then it will motivate you to do better or change. And so we typically hold quite positive beliefs about the usefulness of self-criticism, but the evidence just does not stack up. When we criticise ourselves, we activate the body's threat system. So being both the attacker and the attacked can give you a good hit of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. But flight or fight mode is not a great one to be in, especially when you're trying to study. And most likely you get enough of those stress hormones just from having ADHD, really. You do not need to add to them. So the science is very clear that self-criticism, as well intended as it may be, doesn't have the effect that we think. It can be quite detrimental, and taking a more understanding approach works better and is also better for your mental health. But because it's default mode and self-compassion is more of a learned behaviour, sometimes it is hard to know what to do instead. So, how can you show yourself more compassion? I interviewed uni students with ADHD about how they treat themselves when things go wrong and what makes it easy to treat themselves with compassion. And I'll share a little bit of what I learned. In this interview-based research, what we're looking for is common themes. So experiences that a fair few people tend to mention. And that's what I'll be talking about. So because everyone's ADHD is different and everyone's experience of ADHD is different, some of it might not apply to you, but hopefully there'll be something useful. So one thing that everyone agreed on is that having a diagnosis really helped them to be more understanding towards themselves. But still, one of the biggest barriers to people being compassionate towards themselves was thinking that they don't deserve it, because they're either too flawed as a person, which we'll return to later, or they cause whatever problem they're facing by their own actions or lack of actions, which I think is captured nicely here in this tweet that says having ADHD feels like being stuck in an infinite loop of car crashes where you're somehow the driver and the passenger. It can be hard to feel like you deserve compassion when you know you could have done things differently. You can watch a situation heading to disaster and feel kind of powerless to intervene. Like, for example, this presentation, I went around in circles so many times on various points and took it right to the wire with time, which is exactly the last thing that I wanted to do in a situation where I knew I was going to be anxious anyway. And we shall return to that situation. So, yeah, what I'm saying is that you do deserve compassion for having ADHD. You didn't ask for this, and you do deserve compassion for having a brain type that makes a lot of things harder, including carrying out your best intentions, such as implementing strategies to manage your symptoms. And while we're on a social media break, here's another tweet for you, and something that you surely will have noticed. It is a well-established fact that the symptoms of ADHD interfere with the use of effective strategies for managing ADHD. It's just another one of those fun things about ADHD. So, even when you're not managing your symptoms as well as you might like, you still deserve understanding and support, and you especially deserve it when things aren't going well. Compassion is a response to suffering, and this is a good time to point out that compassion is not the same thing as pity. And that's an important distinction to make, because it's what people sometimes fear. If I start being compassionate to myself, will I just end up watching Netflix all day? And the answer to that is no, because that would be self-pity and self-indulgence, and that's not what we're aiming for here. Self-compassion does have that active component to it. So the awareness and recognition of your suffering and the willingness to take action to help. As I mentioned, another barrier to being kind to yourself can be feeling like you're too flawed as a person. A lot of people live with the so-called moral diagnosis of ADHD before they come to a formal diagnosis, which is basically where your symptoms are mistaken for others, by others, and eventually yourself, for character flaws. So, for example, you might have heard that you're lazy or not trying hard enough. So you might have internalised some of those messages, and you can end up with a pretty negative view of yourself and who you are as a person. And you wouldn't be necessarily feeling that way all the time. It's just that it might be when you do or say something that you think is stupid, for example, that these feelings come crashing in. This is quite a common problem, so I'll include a link to a podcast presentation about it in the chat. So if you think that's something that you want to know more about, you can have a listen to that. So being able to differentiate between character flaws and the symptoms of ADHD has really important implications for your ability to answer the question, what do I need? So an example of that from my own life is I have always struggled with punctuality, and that script in the slide, I can't tell you how many times I've had that running through my head. It is just practically hardwired at this point. So for the longest time I thought I must be a selfish and inconsiderate person who didn't respect other people's time, because that's pretty much how chronic lateness is interpreted. And it didn't really make sense because I felt terrible about it. I felt terrible about being late, but in the absence of any other explanation, I had to consider that that might be true. And I definitely knew I needed to try harder. But, if it wasn't really the problem, it was losing track of time. And learning about time blindness meant that suddenly I had an explanation that made sense, and I had access to strategies that helped like, for example, setting a timer to go off at regular intervals so that I can keep track of time and notice that it's passing. Because that just does not happen on its own. So then these strategies don't work all the time, but on balance, things are much better than they were. And in being able to identify a behaviour as a symptom, not only did the answer to the question, what do I need, go from, trying harder to something that was actually helpful. But I realised that I'm not a terrible person who doesn't care about others. I'm a good person who just has absolutely no concept of time. And working these things out is one part ADHD knowledge and one part mindful self-awareness. So mindfulness is the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. And the author of that definition sometimes adds that this is in the service of self-understanding and wisdom. So meditation is one way of doing that, but it's not the only one, which is just as well, because there is a love-hate relationship with that among people with ADHD. So if you're the kind of person who likes it or wants to try it, there's an excellent book called The Mindfulness Prescription for ADHD, and I'll pop that into the chat later. It does make a compelling case for the use of both mindfulness and meditation for people with ADHD, and it's got some really good ideas in it. Otherwise, a more active way to facilitate mindful self-awareness is journaling. That can help you to really gain perspective on things and get clarity on difficult situations. Writing about your feelings can actually be really helpful when you get stuck with academic writing too. So if you're struggling to get started on something, writing about that instead can be good. It gets you writing, for starters, and bringing mindful awareness to the situation can help you to work out next steps and recognise any thoughts or emotions that might be getting in the way, because avoiding tasks can be related to emotion regulation, and writing sometimes helps with that. But when it comes to mindfulness and developing self-awareness, you don't have to do things in a prescriptive way. Students named a whole variety of things, from exercise to listening to music that help them to quieten their minds and connect with their experience in the present moment. A useful thing when we're talking about self-awareness is that the human brain is evolved to pay special attention to threats and negative information. And in the case of ADHD, not only do we tend to focus on the negative aspects of ourselves a bit too much, but it's a fact that the unfocused brain tends to gravitate towards problems and negative information. And then, of course, there's hyperfocus waiting to take over and get to work. So it's really important to be aware of this natural negativity bias that everyone's brain has, and find ways to actively drag your attention to good information about yourself and your abilities. There are mindfulness sort of practices that focus on that issue, like gratitude practices and self-appreciation practices. But I think an ADHD-friendly way of doing it can be to create an album in the photo app on your phone and screenshot or take photos of things that make you feel good about yourself and who you are, and help you to develop that friendly relationship with yourself, that you are somebody that you actually like. So When it comes to study, you could keep screenshots of positive feedback that you get, but crop out any negative bits because you don't need to be reminded of those. Your brain has got that covered. And also, just don't put all your greatest, most wonderful achievements in there, because you don't want to intimidate yourself. It's not to undermine healthy striving and high achievement, but perfectionism is very prevalent with ADHD, and it can really be a problem. So I don't encourage that one. So I know the slide says a list, and I've been talking about photos, but I do have a list for you. Sometimes when you get stuck on a task, you don't really know the answer to the question, what do I need? And this list was shared with me by someone a few years ago, someone who has ADHD, and I'm sharing it with you here now with her permission, because I think it's a great example of self-compassion. So she made this list called Spanners for Wheel Spinners, which I also really like. And it has a range of considerations and strategies that are useful to her. And I've actually found them quite useful as well, just running through that sometimes. It's amazing what obvious thing you just haven't noticed that's kind of causing problems. So next time you're feeling stuck or overwhelmed, just stop and explore. Your list might look quite different to this one, but it can be really helpful to keep a record of what's helped in the past, because it can be really easy to forget, and probably your difficulties do tend to follow a pattern. So having a list that is a kind and supportive thing that you can do for future you. And yeah, you can keep one of like strategies for academic writing that have helped. It's also quite good to make it look a little bit interesting. I know mine was quite boring when I had one. Yes, so what else can help? When students talked about the times they were able to be compassionate towards themselves, it frequently involves seeking support from other people. So friends and family can be great sources of support, and so can connecting with other people with ADHD, either people that you know or online communities. And I understand that after the last webinar, a group, so there's what you call Teams chat of students who were in that webinar. I don't know, someone in the chat might know about that. So that is just a great example of the common humanity aspect of self-compassion. And other people with ADHD can be a really great source of ADHD knowledge and strategies and tips, and just make you feel less alone in your struggles, because you don't really always see them represented around you. You can feel like you are the only one with this problem. So another important source of support that you're all obviously aware of is uni access. Let's just talk for a moment about reasonable adjustments, which is getting extensions on assignments, for example. These are very much aligned with self-compassion, because sometimes the answer to the question, what do I need, is simply more time. And to illustrate that, I love this image of ADHD storytelling. So it depicts the process of relaying a story verbally, hence why I'm being very scripted here. But it could equally apply to the writing process of trying to produce a piece of written work to a deadline. Can be quite torturous at times, and you can learn many a fun fact that is not central to the actual topic as you get caught up in details and go down rabbit holes. And the first square there, the pre-story prologue for context, could be that you spent weeks just struggling to get started, or you just had a false start, went off entirely in the wrong direction and had to come back and kind of start again. So in some ways I see the use of reasonable adjustments as a proxy for self-compassion. And students are often reluctant to use them or feel guilty when they do. But the university knows that these things might happen for you. And they also know that this does not determine your worth or the value of the contribution that you can make to your field and to society. So please use them without feeling guilty. Getting an extension or multiple extensions is not unusual, and it's an important thing that you can do to show yourself compassion. So apart from what's offered by the university, you might need to make reasonable adjustments of your own. Taking a self-compassionate approach with ADHD can mean not being too attached to the idea that you need to do things in a typical way or conform to ways of doing things that don't suit your brain. In the words of one student, I have a different way of approaching things. I might get around to the same thing a little bit slower than other people, but I get there, which is kind of a bit like what this image is saying. It's okay to take a different path. And it could just be the thing that gets you to the finish line. On that note, if you are struggling to manage at the moment and you know that the answer to the question, what do I need to do? Or what do I need is to drop a unit, then you really need to get onto that this week, because the last day to withdraw without penalty is coming up, without financial penalties. And the ADHD tax is real. You don't want to be paying more of that than you have to. So one thing I like about self-compassion is that it can be reduced down to quite a simple formula. So when you're having a hard time and maybe your inner critic is about to pounce, you can just pause for a moment and run through these three simple things. And I can give you a real life example of what that looks like, because as I said, I really struggled to produce this presentation on time. Even though I started so early, weeks ago, that actually just gave me more time to overthink it. And yeah, it all ended up being finished at the very last minute. So of course I was kind to myself, because I've been studying this for a few years now, and I've gotten really good at being able to be incredibly frustrated at the situation without being frustrated at myself, and just recognising, you know, this is hard and it sucks, as opposed to, you know, I'm useless and I suck. So it's good to just be able to focus on the situation. And then common humanity was a bit of a weird one, because obviously, you know, this is a presentation to the students with ADHD, so it was kind of built into the whole task. But I did speak to friends and get help, just sort of practical and moral support. And that was really lovely. And as for mindfulness, I could not keep it in perspective at all by the time I went to bed last night. I was so stressed. And having to take my own advice, I did a self-compassion guided meditation. It's one that I hadn't tried before, and it's much longer than what I would usually do. It's like 27 minutes or something. But, you know, that's just how stressed I was. And that was great. It really calmed me down and reduced the panic that was building in my mind and my body. It was so good. I did it a second time. But so what I've described here is very much a do-it-yourself sort of strategy. But most of the students that are quite good at it had seen or were seeing a psychologist, and that is sort of consistent with the fact that self-compassion is a learned behaviour. So if you feel like you're already struggling with quite a heavy emotional burden, then consider getting professional support. That could be your first act of self-compassion. And I'll put a link in the chat for the Uni Mental Health Services. And alternatively, ADHD WA, which is the sort of info and support body locally, has a list of psychologists they recommend. So I'll pop that into, and they have ADHD coaches in there too. They can be quite good for learning new strategies. So to summarise, here are my top tips, organised by category. And if you only take one thing away from today, let it be the message that you deserve understanding and support from yourself and other people as well. You are doing a hard thing, so be kind to yourself. That's it from me. Oh, there you are. Hello.
Hello. Thank you, Glenda. Thank you so much there's just so many takeaways there, I think, and practical strategies that we can reflect on. And I appreciate that you're going to put some resources into the chat so that the participants can go away and maybe go and have a look at some of those, particularly say those mindfulness practices. Certainly look that list of self-compassion, that example about the spanners for wheel spinners, that looked excellent in terms of identifying some things that can help at times. So thank you very much for your presentation today. So we'll have a lot more into the chat so that you can go away and reflect on some of the items today. The thing that I just want to check in with you, Glenda, sorry, it's a bit of a question without notice, but one of the things I know students often have said to me is how you build in a buffer or some accountability. Do you have any sort of comments on sort of strategies around, when you're working towards a deadline, how you might build in some accountability, what might have worked for you or for some of the students in your research?
Well, I have had experience with an ADHD coach before, and that can be quite useful for answering those kinds of questions. For myself, I don't know. Sometimes it's just, with not knowing how long things take, it's really hard. Like the other day, my supervisor asked me when I would have this latest task that I need to do ready. And I was just like, by now they know me quite well. I actually have no idea. I need you to tell me when you think it should be ready, and then I'll just try my hardest to do it. Yeah, it's quite tricky.
So I think there's one thing I was wondering. We've got like our Study Smarter team puts together like an assignment calculator, which does something like that.
Oh, those assignment calculators.
Yes. What do you think?
Nightmare. No, yeah. Well, look, I used to use them when I was undergrad. I used them, and I just never actually ever was able to work to one. So then it would get closer and I'd do another one. Right. But they are beneficial from the sense that, they do break it down, and then you also at least recognise when you're not meeting those targets. And that's really useful information, because sometimes you might just have this, you can have an illusion that, oh no, it's fine. And really time is passing and it is getting quite urgent.
So even just making time really much more upfront and visual can be just really helpful in that. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the Study Smarter assignment calculator is useful from that perspective of, you can't at least be in denial about the fact that time is passing and you haven't done the things that you kind of need to.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry, that's just a question without notice, but we'll have a lot more resources in the chat for people to have a look at and have a think through. So thank you again, Glenda, for your time. We really appreciate you sharing also your personal experiences. That has been really helpful too, so thank you so much. And just before we go, I'd just like to note our ADHD webinar that's coming up on Tuesday, the 20th of September. And that's going to be with Catherine Lightfoot, who represents our career. She's a career advisor from UWA Careers and Employability. And the topic will be ADHD career considerations and advice. So again, another excellent topic in the series. So we hope you can all join us then too. So thank you again.